Good morning. Together, we continue our journey to the resurrection. During this season of Lent, we've looked to our theme, Full to the Brim, as an invitation to full life, to be authentically the person we are created to be, to counter scarcity and injustice, and to pour out grace wherever we go. When we are filled to the brim with love and with grace, that grace pours over, spilling into spaces and people beyond ourselves. And I am pleased to be on this journey with you, brothers and sisters seeking to live fully, to love fully, to receive fully. The words of Psalm 32 invite us to examine the notion that we can hide from God. The writer laments how they kept their sin a secret and celebrates the relief and freedom that came when their burdens were shared with God. While I kept silent, my body wasted away through my groaning all day long. Then I acknowledged my sin to you and did not hide my iniquity, and you forgave the guilt of my sin. These words are a reminder that our bodies and our faith are inseparable. Accepting and embracing God's grace through honest confession brings healing to our heart, to our mind, and to our body. I confess there have been times, and there will be more times, when I have felt far from God. Sometimes I even like to think that my thoughts are my own thoughts, and God is not clued into. But I am woefully wrong. For God knows my heart, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And God forgives, and God offers grace. When I was 16 or 17 years old, I was asked to drive my grandma Heiser to a funeral. As I was backing my parents' extremely large gray Pontiac out of the single car garage door, I'm setting up the scene, it was very small, and a very large car. I scraped the entire driver's side of the car against the frame of the garage door. Instantly, my thought was, maybe no one will notice. As it turned out, once again, I was woefully wrong, for my father, who was standing on a ladder at the back of the house, felt the impact, was down that ladder and into the garage in an instant. He looked at the car, he looked at the garage. He simply inched the car out into the driveway. Meanwhile, I am hysterical. I am crying. I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. Dad got the car out. He gave me a hug and said, go get your grandma. I was shocked. What I needed was for my father to yell at me, which he does not do. I needed him to at least say, Jerri, Ann, you have got to be more careful. Or perhaps no longer trust me to go get his 80-something-year-old grandmother and take her to a funeral. Instead, I received a hug and was sent on my way. My dad offered me grace and has not brought that incident up yet. A couple of days ago, I got to talk with my dad on the phone, and I told him I was sharing this story and thanked him for showing forgiveness and grace in such a beautiful, memorable way for me. You know, my dad barely remembered the incident. I believe he said, I don't think there was a lot of damage. I love my dad, and I strive to be like my dad. So as we look to the gospel reading, which is so beautifully read from the Navajo tradition, it's important to begin with the opening verses before jumping into the three parables that follow: the lost sheep, the lost coin, the lost son. Jesus is being accused by the Pharisees and scribes of inappropriate behavior. He has been spotted welcoming sinners. He's even been found eating with them. So Jesus responds to these accusations by telling these three stories, each speaking of God who loves sinners, of a God who cares for the lost and is happy to dine with those who are looked down upon. Donald Crable, an author, lecturer, and educator of the Anabaptist faith and culture, calls this the upside down kingdom, where martial law is suspended and utterly unselfish love becomes the new rule of governance. He calls this an upside down kind of love, a love that goes beyond personal passion, beyond sweet friendship, beyond benevolent do-goodism. It's more of an unselfish love. It's more than unselfish love feelings. It's a love which acts, a love that supersedes self-interest, like the love and grace that my dad showed. So we look to the very familiar parable. As we know, we have the younger son. He's asked his father for his inheritance. And according to Jewish law, this son was entitled to 1/3 of his inheritance to be given to him at the time of the father's death, or if the father so decides prior to his death. Now, children were expected to honor their parents by obeying them and maintaining them financially. So the sin here, as far as the Jewish culture is concerned, comes from the son's gross disrespect of his father. This was worse than his squandering of his inheritance or his lewd behavior. So to make the story even worse, Jesus adds in a little bit more suspense and excitement as he says that the son ends up caring for pigs. This was an occupation absolutely prohibited by those of the Jewish tradition. And he not only cares for the pigs, but he almost puts himself on the same level as the pigs as he contemplates, out of a deep hunger and desperation, to eat their food. In a sense, to dine with them. The son can no longer continue to live this way. He decides it's time to return home, and on his way, he prepares this elaborate and very humble speech that he's going to give to his father. He plans to offer his service as a hired hand. He knew he deserved no more. He had disrespected his father. He humbled himself. He returned home to be met by his father with open arms, new clothes, and a feast. He wasn't even given an opportunity to share his confession. Instead, his father welcomes him not as a defamed child, but as the son with the emblems of power as prestige. There was steak, and there was music, and there was dancing. The older son, however, is offended by this gracious offer of this brother who squandered his father's inheritance. There are many layers to this brother. The one who is concerned about justice and equity and fairness, he reacts as I would have reacted, perhaps as you would have reacted, with hurt and anger and resentment. I get it. It's not fair. And the father understands the older son's anger and reassures him of his love and his appreciation. He offers him grace while challenging him to do the same for his little brother. And Jesus ends the story here. There's no hallmark ending with the two brothers hugging one another and eating and dancing together. There's no end to this story. That's it. And that's okay. Perhaps Jesus didn't want the listeners to feel good, so he leaves it open-ended. Let them think about it, maybe make up their own ending. So we're left with a bit of tension. On one hand, Jesus illustrates the love of God, a love that reaches beyond human love as we understand it. The Father in the parable demonstrated an extraordinary love. On the other hand, we are reminded that Jesus tells this story to make a point to his critics, who were questioning him for welcoming and dining with the outcast, the sinners, the marginalized, those who were not welcome. These critics are behaving as the elder brother who cannot join in the rejoicing of the lost son returning home. Both of these themes stand on their own while sharing a common thread. Jesus came preaching the love of God, a love that surpasses the love experienced by humanity. This expression of divine love may also stir up resentment in those of us who have already decided who is worthy of God's love and who is not, who is welcome at the table and who is not. It is not up to us to decide who is worthy of God's grace. As Paul writes in Ephesians 4, but to each of us grace has been given as Christ apportioned it. It's not a parable that fits neatly in a box with a pretty bow on top. And in preparing for this morning's message, I had to come to the point of saying that this is not a parable that makes a lot of sense to me ethically. I'm simply reminded that God is much bigger than my understanding. And likewise, God's grace is much bigger as well. It overflows into paths that I cannot comprehend. Philip Yancey writes, grace means that there is nothing we can do to make God love us more or to make God love us less. Grace, like water, flows to the lowest part. Grace, like a cup overflowing, runs over, spilling into spaces and into people beyond ourselves. Grace is a gift. Ashley DeTartbert writes, God puts no limits on grace. Our lives can be a bit full, messy, complicated, imperfect, a wreck, and God's grace is still there. When have you received grace from someone? And when have you offered grace? When have you experienced God's grace? My challenge this week, and I hope yours as well, is to offer grace to those we encounter. It may be as simple as offering it to somebody who pulls out in front of you on the way home from church. Or it may be much more personal, a place of deep hurt, of regret, anger, disappointment, or sadness. May we be found offering and receiving grace in our lives, just as we've received it from our God who offers grace without limits. May we all rest in that. Amen.